Okay, so for today's conversation, the big question here is, in your experience as an investor, and you've been investing for many number of years and you've got your own successful startup, what differentiates between a successful, thriving startup and one that has failed or is failing?
I think for certainly the early stage startups, it's a lot about the people who are behind it rather than what the particular product may well be and the problem that they're trying to solve. So really it is about fundamentally the people, and probably the number one criteria is their resilience, which is their capacity to keep on going when things don't work out as planned, which inevitably they don't. And inevitably the product they developed is in some way the incorrect product. And so really probably what differentiates those ones is their capacity to keep going and pivot, learn, and keep moving is probably what differentiates those that are successful from those that aren't. I mean, some that don't are ones that just keep going down the same path for years and years and years without changing, or ones that just hit the first roadblock and kind of give up.
100%. It's a pretty difficult journey. So I get what you mean about the resilience factor for sure. So can you explain a bit more about what you mean when you say resilience? Like, what does that look like? What have you seen?
Yeah, well, what I've seen is when things get tough, let's say they launch the first version of product and they don't get many customers for it, or circumstances whereby, for personal circumstances, particularly often when people have children, it's quite common, which is really tough for a founder. If trying to provide for a family and your startup isn't earning any income. I think there's also founders, by and large, quite often, lots of startups I've been involved in, the founders have fallen out. And, that's the cause of lots of failures of startups, is the relationships and the relationships with other founders. And, particularly where one founder does all the work and the other one doesn't. So lots of tensions between founders.
Yeah.
So, there's lots of difficulties that people can have in the early stage. I've certainly seen through lots of startups I've invested in a fair amount of mental health issues resulting from what's a really, really difficult journey in terms of burnout. People over-identifying with their startup, and when it fails, they personally fail and they disappear. I try and do a fair amount of coaching and mentoring when they do fail to say, hey, we're investors. We expect majority of our startups to fail, and don't take it too personally. Try and move on.
So, Rob, when you are looking to invest, how can you tell if a person has got this resilience that you're talking about?
So in some cases, you can hear it in the backstories the startups have in terms of their journey of how they've got to where they are. And in other cases, what I try and do generally is try to engage really, really early in the piece with startups, so you can see how they progress and how they deal with difficult issues. There has not been many cases where I've invested in a startup the first time I've ever met them. It's normally perhaps 6 to 12 months, even longer, when I've had the opportunity to meet with them a couple of times and seen how they progress and how they deal with adversity in that journey. That then gives you some insight in terms of how resilient they may well be going forward.
And what particular traits, you keep talking about getting back up and you talked about learning, but what particular traits help them, do you think, be these resilient people, founders, versus those that maybe are not so?
It's a tough one. I think perhaps depending upon their motivation and their reason for doing their startup in their first place, probably has a large degree of impact upon whether or not they keep going. I mean, if they're really, really motivated to solve a problem that they're passionate and they're committed, then they're more likely to perhaps go through those hard times. Whereas there are lots that basically they're startup ideas that they've generated off a whiteboard. The founders aren't going to have that passion and commitment to move forward with.
I'm also curious around this learning and being so connected to the idea. Is there a piece in there that you've seen that may be connected to this resilience?
Most people are looking for entrepreneurs who are coachable, which means, ideally what you want to do is, as a test, you give them some advice and, see whether or not they evaluate that advice or do they just discard it. So you're looking for some indication that they are coachable, that they are listening, and likelihood if they're listening to you, hopefully they're also listening to their customers rather than just blindly pushing ahead with whatever solution that they have. Because in many, many cases, a lot of the startups are solutions looking for problems to solve rather than trying to solve problems.
Yeah, so I think what I'm also hearing is actually being able to disconnect yourself from that product and that problem to ensure that you've then got the capability to pivot when you hear something isn't quite working. So you can keep moving.
Yeah. What happens as well is, from my experience so far, the successful founders that I've been involved in are in fact the technical founders.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because the problem is the technical founders have got the capability to actually dive in and fix the code themselves. So they have that capacity, they have the control over their own product. Whereas the people that don't necessarily know how to code, they're not the developers themselves, they don't have control over what is a pivotal part of their product, which is the software. And that causes a huge amount of anxiety and stress. From what I've seen, the success is coming from those teams that have that technical capability in the founding team.
I'm also interested about the founder fallout that you're talking about, the resilience piece. And I'm wondering from your perspective, what you've seen, the reason is that these fallouts happen.
The startups I'm thinking about where the two founders were best friends, they ultimately fell out because they brought other people into the founding team. And those people then created issues and then they then fell out. What certainly seems to create success is those people who do have some pre-existing relationship. And you see that a lot, really, don't you, in terms of best friends, brothers, husband and wives. Quite often those types of people tend to go on and form successful startups. So when you get people who get thrown together into a startup without really knowing each other is quite often when those problems evolve.
I think, Rob, what I'm hearing is that people with similar value sets,
yes, could be
ones who are likely to last, whereas those that maybe have been thrown together and haven't actually yet worked out what their values are, they then discover that actually they're not the same at all. I don't know, what's your take on that? Because I'm a bit of a value Nazi. So tell me in your words what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I can't say categorically, but certainly defining the values is certainly not first up in the process of putting together founding teams. And maybe what they should be doing first is looking at what their values are and making sure they're aligned and agreeing what they are first. So it could possibly be that they're not aligned in terms of why they're doing it in the first place and what their values are and taking it forward. So it could be a combination of both of those. Talking about founders, I mean, it's a really tough solo journey for people to do startups on their own. So we encourage people to do it with a co-founder. But at the same time, that sometimes causes more disharmony and more problems than it solves in some case. These days, I'm having a tendency to encourage people to potentially hold off on finding a co-founder until they're sure that they've found the right person.
Yeah. And I've noticed that as teams grow and, they raise a bit of money and they start hiring people, again, there's this potential to have lots of fallout and, again, fail as a business. What have you noticed the difference between the ones that grow successfully versus crumble at that point where they're hiring?
Certainly there's lots of standard practices, premature hiring of people doing sales and business development roles.
We've heard this. Yep.
That generally it doesn't work out. And of course, they blame the sales business development person for not being very good, is quite common. That's the most common hiring problem I see is people hiring sales BD people too early in the process. And that not working out.
And what's their reason for doing it? Why do founders hire salespeople?
It's if you're talking technical co-founders, they like to build stuff generally and be more focused on the tech. Yeah, unfortunately, early stage startups, probably the founder is probably the best person to be out there selling the product in those early days.
And so then you mentioned the technical co-founders in your experience tend to be perhaps a bit more successful. So what is it about them again that then they are, it sounds like they're getting their hands dirty a bit more. Maybe they're willing to do these sales. What have you noticed?
In many cases, those ones I'm thinking of, they're good at selling their own product. They are generally pretty well-rounded founders who have those technical skills and are also good in front of customers.
What makes them good in front of customers?
I think they're pretty passionate, reasonably committed, and they believe in themselves. I think there's a degree of self-confidence that perhaps being able to secure the confidence of the customer.
Yeah. Especially because it's very competitive. They've got organizations knocking on the door. So you've got to actually really believe that what you've got to give works.
Yeah.
So I'd like you to take you back to the beginning again, where you are maybe being pitched to by a bunch of startups. I have two questions here, but I'll ask one at a time. The first one is, do you see any trends of missing skills or missing learnings or common trip ups that is making you go, definitely not investing in them because?
So probably the team slide is probably a big one that's quite often underdone in most slide presentations, and it's probably one of the most important ones. There's probably lots of presentations where it's really hard to understand what it is, what problem they're solving and who they're solving it for. If I can't understand what the product is and what problem it's solving, then I'm not quite sure a customer will be able to either. Yeah, lots of presentations that focus far too much on the solution that they're offering with, pictures of what the product is. So that's always a bit of a warning sign in terms of those people who are talking about the solution rather than the customer and what problem they're solving for the customer.
And when you say that's a warning sign because?
It's a warning sign because they haven't really identified what problem that they're solving, and they've gone quite some path already down the path of developing a solution with really not understanding what the customer problem is.
Back to the problem. Yeah. What else?
Pet hate is the people who will say, my startup is the Airbnb of such and such.
Yeah. I can imagine people saying that too.
Which they do. In most cases, you go, no, you're nothing like the Airbnb. And you can't explain what your own startup does without having to revert to some naff comparison like that. That's always for me a big warning sign. Other one is just not having any form of ask, not being specific about what it is that they're actually looking for, be it how much money they're looking to raise and what valuation they're talking about.
Yeah, you've listened to this whole presentation. Yeah, what should I do with this?
Yeah.
What do you want from me? That's nice.
That's right. What do you want? Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to go back to that team slides comment. So on the flip side, what does an excellent pitch look like? And it may be the reverse of what you're saying, but it could be some other things as well that you just go, yes, you can have my money.
I think the truth is, for most people, is that basically they're solving a problem that somehow you can resonate with, more than likely. Maybe it's something you've experienced yourself, or it's a problem that perhaps you can identify with in some shape, way or form that you may have experienced yourself or that you're aware of that is a problem. I think is pretty common.
Is that more about like you understand the space as well?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I love that. It's very honest.
I think as investors, we love to think that we're unbiased, but we have a natural bias towards startups that are solving problems that we can understand. And or have experienced.
I guess extending on that, does it make sense for startups to build relationships with investors or try and seek out the ones that do have a relationship to the problem?
Absolutely. When you see startups and you look where the investment capital comes from, by and large, in terms of raising capital, seeking out those customers who you think will have an understanding of the problem. I mean, so many startups are out there pitching to everybody and anybody when perhaps they need to be far more strategic about who they are targeting in terms of those potential investors who have a genuine interest in their problem domain. Because all the VC funds, they've all got a sweet spot of where they like to invest and what they invest in. So be strategic, find out who they are and target them. That's
great. And then maybe you can expand. So on the people slide, you talked about the people having an advisory. What is it about the person? I mean, you talked about resilience. Got that. What else?
In terms of the problem that they're trying to solve, having some experience in the domain, whatever it might be, let's say education. So someone who's coming from, they've got an ed tech startup and they've got some background in education as a teacher or something like that, then that's a plus. And then also looking for, people that have got a skill set somewhere in the technology that they're using, whatever, just to solve the problem. If it's software, then ideally you're looking for somebody who's got some experience, be it as a software programmer themselves or a project manager or an IT manager of some shape, way or form. So really, it's that combination of the domain expertise, the technical knowledge, and combining that hopefully with passion and commitment to the problem.
Your problem, people, anything else you look for?
I guess you're generally looking for a market that is growing in the future rather than declining market.
Makes sense. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. That was really insightful.
Great, fantastic.
Really, really cool. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Susie. Nice to meet you. Thanks.
Yeah, really nice to meet you. And it's so lovely to feel all your energy coming through. You're bringing this infectious energy. I'm going to bounce off now.
Okay, cool.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.